Right. So Colin, who I taught in 203 several years ago, approached me this fall to take over the mentorship since Professor Lee had left for Korea. And I was quite happy to do so because his topic touched on Sino-Italian relations. And since I have family in Italy, and actually my uncle worked at the University of Trieste years ago. So this particular topic was of great interest to me. And given the time limitations and Colin's own language training, I thought, Colin, you did an admirable job here. I'll press you on what remains unfinished business, but I thought this is an excellent first step. So without further ado, let's hear your presentation.
Sure. So I'll start with what I wanted to show, which was basically, obviously you guys have all read the paper, so you know kind of my main points and what I get into in the information. But what I wanted to show mainly was basically Chinese grand strategy and the China dream, and that the BRI is currently one of the most important things Beijing is doing to reach that goal. That goal being, the China dream, national rejuvenation, becoming a strong, powerful nation with global influence. And I also wanted to convey that Europe is a big part of that. So the BRI can be seen as, and this comparison I didn't actually put in my paper because I didn't think that I think it's not the most perfect comparison, but just kind of as a basic kind of introduction conversation, I think it's an interesting point. That the BRI can be seen as kind of a continuation of the three worlds theory, which you might know the Maoist theory of the first world being the two imperialist powers, the US and the USSR. The second world being Europe, Canada, Japan, and the countries of kind of the global north. So like you could also put Australia in there. And then the third world being Africa, Latin America, and continental Asia. So and then China would fall into the third world. So the kind of essence of that theory was to unite the progressive third world countries to try and win over the middle, so to speak, second world countries to gain influence against the imperialist countries. So Beijing kind of sees Europe in a similar light right now. Beijing sees the US as like trying to contain China, and they know, and the US knows, and it's quite obvious that that strategy is tough enough to contain a rising China, and that it would be basically impossible without European allies. And so stealing away US allies in Europe is a big part of ensuring that China can continue to rise without the US putting it down. So on that note, Italy is an important US ally in Europe, an important country in Europe in general. And having the Italians sign on to the BRI is a pretty big win for China in the so-called middle space between China and the US. So I also wanted to convey that political gain was the primary goal for Beijing. That was one of my big findings. And that they likely hope to kind of follow that up with investments in order to further pull a US ally towards China, more towards the third world, so to speak, and a little farther away from the US, kind of gain some balance. However, if we look at one area of investment, such as Trieste, which obviously I looked at in my paper, we can see that Chinese investment in Italy hasn't really moved forward much at all. And that is due to a number of factors that I explained in my writing, which I won't go over here. You guys have all seen those reasons, those findings that I came to. And then also I wanted to convey that the kind of two extremes that a lot of people were very confused at, especially when I started writing this maybe like 8-9 months after the deal had been signed, which is about a year ago from now, that there were these kind of extremes that everybody was talking about, whether the Chinese investment was going to overrun Trieste and turn it into like Piraeus, or that it was going to be a very positive thing, which you could also, depending on how you look at Piraeus, use that as an example, or like the quote I use in my writing, the Singapore of the Adriatic. So those were two extremes, and my finding was that it was not going to be anywhere near either of those extremes, and I wanted to convey that idea. So how I went about showing it. So I went about showing this using Trieste, obviously, as a case study. And for my sources, I used various sources, including scholarly literature about Chinese foreign policy, Chinese grand strategy more broadly. I used a lot of secondary analysis of the BRI MOU and just the situation going on at Trieste. And I also used a lot of primary sources, which I thought were the most interesting that came out of Trieste, such as like interviews with the port authorities, local newspapers were always interesting. Feasibility reports, even for like railway expansions and stuff like that. So yeah, lots of sources like that. My greatest contribution. So where I think I made my greatest contribution in this was really in explaining like in detail the situation around Chinese investment in Trieste, because especially like it's a little more clear now. There's like other people writing about this, and you can find, granted there's smaller kind of news reports, but you can find people that have come to similar conclusions that I have. But when I first started writing this, especially like 8-9 months ago, or rather 8-9 months after the deal and about a year ago from now, it was very unclear what was going on there. And like I said, there were people talking more on the extremes of whether it was going to be good or bad, but people really didn't understand the nature of the deals, how much money was going to be flowing into Trieste, or what this meant for the future of Trieste. And obviously up until this point, the money that's flowing in has been zero. And also when I say people didn't understand, I mean, first of all, the general public, which is somewhat understandable. They're not looking very in detail at this, but also the media didn't, they were very extreme both ways. And even scholars, I think I've told you, Dr. Howard, Dr. Schenk, about the professor I was working with a little bit in Rome. And he mentioned the same thing, that it brought a lot of clarity to something. His area of research was, China and the Mediterranean. And he was even saying that this was something that was not very clear yet, and that the paper he thought brought a lot of clarity to that. So that's what I think my best, greatest contribution was. Even now, if you look at those kind of other reports on this that explain some of these same conclusions, they're not quite as detailed. And I think my paper just gives a lot of detailed clarity to a confusing area, or a confusing event rather. So my biggest challenge in doing this, what I think I would change. So my biggest challenge was probably just kind of defining exactly what I wanted to do. So I started looking so much into this and got all this interesting information. And I started looking at all the things going on in Trieste, and I thought that was really interesting. And I started looking at, Italy more broadly, and what China was doing there. And just, I had a lot of information at the end, and I needed to kind of define exactly what I wanted to argue, because I had so many kind of interesting points that I thought were coming out. And that's also where I thought you guys helped a lot, to be able to kind of get a fresh set of eyes on it and say, this is, a lot of great stuff, but it'd be, more clear, more interesting if you could tie it into something bigger, such as Chinese foreign policy more broadly, or Chinese grand strategy. But as far as like sourcing and other things like that, that was tough, especially like in the beginning, like 8-9 months after the deal. It was obviously very scattered, and it was hard to find some stuff, and some of it was in Italian and English and Chinese, and none of those languages are perfect for me. So I had to find those different areas, but it was there eventually. Once I got it all together, the information was there enough to come to good conclusions. So that was pretty straightforward. It was more of just defining exactly what I wanted to do with all my various information. As far as what I do differently, I'm not sure exactly what I'd do differently. Perhaps not split up the beginning of my thesis and then the second half by a year, which was, even though that was kind of a good and bad, because I had to do a lot of updating when I write the first half and do a lot of the initial research, and then a year later I'm writing the second half, and then also updating all the initial information a lot. But I also learned a lot in that 1 year, so I thought that was beneficial as well. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what I would do different, but yeah, that's about all I have. If you guys have any questions.
No, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. Please, I don't know who wants to go first. No one's jumping in. I have some questions. So first, Colin, my first question is how, you talked about you talked about connecting your findings to larger theory or discussion about Chinese foreign policy and things like that. But one thing I'm curious about, kind of connecting your work to other scholars, is how does this memorandum of understanding compare to other kinds of memoranda of understanding? And, is that a common thing between countries? Is it not that common? Is it really common in this, BRA initiative? I mean, is it something, like I said, is it something that countries enter into all the time and they don't really mean very much? Like, how is this kind of agreement, how has this kind of agreement been used?
Yep. So as far as just other countries in general, that's not something I looked into because I was mostly looking just at China. I didn't really look into theoretically like MOUs in general, but I did look into how China kind of does this. And that was one of the things when I said I was defining what I wanted to talk about. That was one of the things I was considering talking about is how it like relates to other Chinese MOUs. And I kind of mentioned it, I think in my conclusion, how China does sign a lot of MOUs with the BRI, and a lot of times they don't seem to mean anything. People think that they wonder why there's so many MOUs that deals don't get followed up on. Some you sign an MOU and hundreds of deals come from it, not necessarily hundreds, but plenty of deals come from it, and they actually get followed through upon. And then others don't come to anything. And part of that is, like I mentioned, I think in my conclusion that Chinese diplomats have, or Chinese officials have some agency in this. They get, that's kind of my theory, but they get promoted for coming up with these MOUs, and that's something that I was also told by the professor in Rome. He said that that's a big part of it, so that's kind of where I got that from. But yeah, China, I think these MOUs kind of open the door for investment, and they're just kind of a confidence building thing, which is what they're meant to be. But China takes that a little step farther than most people. They can do these things with, and then kind of choose to follow through or not later, but they get political gain from it. And yeah, so that was kind of what I saw in this, kind of confirmed that it seemed like they got the political gain from it, and then they can choose to follow through with investments later, or they can choose to basically ignore it. Yeah. So as far as other countries, I think that other countries tend to put more thought into MOUs, perhaps. And when they're going to do them, they're really plan to follow through with them. But then again, also other countries aren't putting out an initiative like the BRI with hundreds of other countries and spending millions and millions on investment.
So got it. All right. Other questions, please?
Well, can I follow Dr. Schenk's question on Colin, on page 9? I don't know if you've got your thesis handy, but at the bottom of page 9, you list a number of questions you're going to try to answer, and one of them is, how does the MOU compare with other ports which China developed in previous years? Is Trieste different? I wonder if you could elaborate on those questions.
Sure. So kind of what I was getting at before is, yeah, so like Piraeus would be a very good, stark, different example. So Piraeus had, it was a similar situation. Greece, after the financial crisis, was in a bad spot, obviously. And Italy is in a similar spot now, and perhaps worse now because of coronavirus, but they were in 2019 when they signed this. And so in the case of Greece, those investments really did turn into something. Millions were invested in Piraeus and in Greece, more generally in Athens and other areas. And it turned into a lot of economic development. It really went somewhere, whereas here, and it went somewhere relatively fast too. At this point, I don't know exactly the numbers or anything, but at this point, after signing MOUs with Greece in 2008 or 2009, there was a lot more investment than we see in Italy right now. So basically, the answer would be that yes, this is different than other MOUs. MOU with Italy is different than other MOUs, and a very stark example of a different one would be Piraeus in Greece, where it really did turn into something. And now the port is I think for a couple of years was the fastest growing port in Europe, the port of Piraeus, and it's one of the top ports in the Mediterranean now. So yeah, that would definitely be a stark example of how it could be different. And there's the potential that Italy was planning, or that China was planning to do something like that in Italy, but because of the reasons I listed, and maybe because they were never really planning to do that at all, that just hasn't turned out. So,
did you find documentation from, for instance, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China talking about Trieste and this memorandum and building on their experience in Greece?
I didn't find anything that directly compared it to Greece that I can remember. I know a lot of other people compared it to Greece, but I didn't see anything coming out of Beijing, any official statements that I remember comparing it to Greece. But no, to be honest with you, I don't remember any specific statements coming out of Beijing about that. But a lot of other people did compare it to that. That was what a lot of people were thinking it might turn out like. So.
Related to that, I was actually curious, rereading your thesis in the final draft form, and you just mentioned Piraeus again. You know, if Piraeus was already a place where they had, you know, China had invested a lot and had, you know, the port had become more, had grown a lot in terms of use and everything. What are the advantages of Trieste as opposed to Piraeus, and why, you know, if China did really mean to turn, you know, Trieste into a Singapore in the Adriatic, like, would it have then abandoned Piraeus, like, or would it have gone with two near each other? Like, what are the advantages of opening up kind of a second option if Piraeus already was so successful?
Yeah, I don't think they would have abandoned Piraeus in any way, especially not, at least not for a long time. They've had a lot of success there, and the Greek government has been pretty accommodating to them. And it also took 10 years to get to where, you know, that started in like 2008, well, over 10 years now, to get to that kind of success. But they do save a lot of time. I forget the exact numbers because I compared it to the time they'd save in Trieste to if they were to go to Northern European ports, and then also Piraeus. So I forget exactly how much time they save, but they do save quite a bit of time going into some areas in Central and especially Western Europe by using Trieste. So they save money, they save time, especially for like food products. I remember reading about that. And then they also, like I said, they get the political gains from that, and that might have been their main goal, you know, from the beginning. But yeah, they're just, in my opinion, they're just trying to expand a lot, and I think that one port is, you know, they'd rather also expand into closer ports that provide material benefits, political benefits, and they just, you know, continue to expand. That was basically the goal from my understanding of it.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, because I was just thinking if they had no other option in the Mediterranean, then Trieste would really be like this huge breakthrough. But maybe this bolsters your argument that it's more for the political consequences of making an agreement with, you know, Italy, I guess is certainly has more weight internationally than Greece.
Yeah, and then also that was part of what I started to get into my conclusion, but that's pretty unclear now because that's relatively recent. But a Chinese SOE bought stake in a Greek railway construction company so that they can start basically expanding further in Greece. So I think that's true, that they're basically going to stick to Piraeus. That's the success that they've had so far, and they'll probably stick to that. But why not try to expand is probably the idea, and they get political gains in the meantime.
Was there similar backlash to Piraeus's development in the Western media and in the EU and in US foreign policy circles?
Yes, there was a lot. I was, of course, mostly looking at Italy, but yeah, through looking at Piraeus, I saw a lot of that. So in Greece, I actually went to Athens once, and when I was in the middle of doing this, when I was doing the study abroad in Rome, and got to just, I didn't do anything really academic, but I asked a couple of people that I met what they thought of Chinese investment in the area, and they all gave me the same response that, the Chinese own half the city. They didn't seem happy about it. But it's kind of mixed. I've heard mixed stuff. People that work at the port are happy because their jobs are kind of booming, but then some were mad about the way that the Chinese were managing things. There was obviously a lot of kind of uproar in the EU when Greece blocked those proposals, and I forget what year they blocked a couple, but that were condemning China for human rights abuses and their actions in the South China Sea. People were obviously very alarmed at that they couldn't get something that was not that controversial through the EU to put out a statement. So yeah, there was definitely backlash with the investment Piraeus, and also they actually own, I think, 60% of the port Piraeus, which wouldn't be a possibility in Trieste because Italian law doesn't allow that. So it's a little different in Greece. And, so yeah, there was definitely backlash in Greece as well and in the EU.
Interesting. Dr. Guo, have you any questions?
Yeah, I have two questions, one more general than the other. My first question is just following up on Professor Howard and Professor Schenk's question. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the generalization or generalizability of your study to other settings at a more abstract level, like what factors uh, come into play or affects the success or failure of the BRI projects around the world. So kind of a more theoretical abstraction there. Um, I think you already touched on those. I think very meticulous, very impressive study in your thesis. But yeah, just maybe say a little bit more about that. And second is that a growing literature in growing topic in the literature on China-Italy relationship is the tens of thousands of Chinese migrants in Italy. What role do they play in the BRI? Or I mean, it's probably an unfair question because this is not um, central to your research topic, but I just wonder if you have seen anything related to that.
So your first question was how it relates to more generally my findings, kind of. So that was actually kind of a roundabout answer, but one of the findings that I had, which was something that people had talked about before I started this research, was that that, as we can see, there's stark differences in how they behaved in Trieste and how they behaved in like Piraeus, for example. That the BRI is extremely dynamic and fluid, and depending on, you ask what factors influence it, all factors, political factors, economic factors, everything, and they all of that stuff factors into how they interact with different countries. Some countries have a ton of investment in the political kind of dialogue is different. It changes a lot depending on what country they're in, and for so many factors. Okay, so your second question being about Chinese migrants in Italy. So I looked a little bit at that. So I was going to start to get into that more, and then one of the things I realized is whether that was influencing trade or relations. And I realized there's actually more Chinese migrants, I think, in the UK and like in London, and also in another European country, I forget whether it was Germany or France. So there are a lot of Chinese migrants in other cities in Europe as well, but Italy definitely has a large population of Chinese migrants. And all I really saw about that was Italians' views, like I looked at like their perceptions of China as using like Pew studies or polls and whatnot. And Italians generally have like a disfavorable view of China. And they gave reasoning that it might be because Chinese within Italy stay very tight-knit and tight-knit communities. They don't integrate into the local community quite as much as other populations do. And so that Italians have this view that they're kind of outsiders within Italy. And so that, that I guess gives them somewhat of a negative view of Chinese in Italy. That's all I really saw about that topic. And I was wondering how that might affect their relations in, BRI cooperation, whether the general public has a favorable view or not of China. I figured might affect that. But yeah, I didn't go too deep into that. That's about all I saw on that topic.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, thank you. Just quick follow up on the first one. Yes, definitely all kinds of factors come into play. But if you were to assign some relative weight from China's perspective, is geopolitical concern or economic or financial concern more important in different projects? For example, you mentioned the Sri Lanka case, the Greek case, and so on. Are those mostly driven by China's geopolitical intuition, or is it the Chinese SOEs trying to make some quick money, or something else?
Yeah, so if I had to answer that just directly, I'd say first would be geopolitical concerns, then economic concerns, and then there are a bunch of other actors like you just mentioned, the Chinese SOEs that have agency in this and influence this as well. But going off of how dynamic it is, again, depending on what country it is, that matters for what's more important. Some countries, it might be economics that are more important, whereas other countries, it's definitely geopolitical. Pakistan, for example, although that's probably 50-50 would be Pakistan, because there's a lot of economic activity going through the west of China that they want to develop the west of China through Pakistan. That's also huge geopolitical concerns with Pakistan. Sri Lanka is definitely, that would be a good example of something that's almost entirely at this point geopolitical. They haven't gotten any economic returns. They've lost money in Sri Lanka. So it really depends on what country you're looking at, whether they care more about economics or geopolitics. They're opportunistic, I guess. But yeah, geopolitics, I think, are the most important thing when you're looking at the BRI.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies things a lot.
I had a few questions about Italy's motivations and participation in the MOU. Why did Rome favor Trieste over, say, a port like Genoa, which is a bigger port and has more capacity for big ships? And why was there also kind of a political motivation there too, to challenge Trieste's free status there, to try to control Trieste more, or was it economic in nature there?
Yeah, I think so. That situation is a little confusing, but I think that as far as the free status or the free port status of Trieste, I don't think it was trying to control Trieste necessarily. I didn't read anything about that. It was just more that I think Rome kind of views Trieste as Italian territory, whereas some in Trieste don't view it that way. And so Rome doesn't really think about it. They assign whatever to Trieste, and they don't really think about their free status or free port status. But as far as Genoa, they did also actually during or on the sidelines of the MOU, the BRI MOU, Chinese SOEs signed deals with Genoa as well as another port. I can't remember which port it was, but so they also did look there. But I think that the kind of hype around Trieste was that Genoa was already a relatively booming port in Italy, not nearly like Trieste, which has been pretty slow for a long time. And so they were it was a revival thing, whereas Genoa would have been kind of small scale, just upping the port's, some investments, whereas Trieste could have been a complete turnaround project. People were thinking, at least, turning a very sleepy port into something booming. And so I think that's why there was just more hype around Trieste. But yes, they did also look at Genoa as well. And the Chinese were interested in that. And some people even thought that pretty early on that Trieste wouldn't actually get anything because the Chinese weren't looking for such a big investment. And some people thought, oh, maybe they'll just go to Genoa and do something there and flake out on the kind of Trieste agreement. So,
all right, well, congratulations.